Good morning and welcome to Let's Talk New Mexico. I'm your host this week, Daniel Montano. Most of us don't hesitate to go to the doctor or ask a friend for advice when we have a sore throat or a bad knee, but when it comes to digestive health, the conversations are few and far between. Social stigma and taboo loom over subjects like constipation, diarrhea, or blood in the stool, even though early treatment can be critical in catching potential deadly diseases. Colorectal cancer rates have been soaring recently, especially in people under 50. At the same time, growing research into the gut-brain connection is revealing powerful links between the gastrointestinal tract and everything from the immune system to our mental health. And yet, despite its central role in our overall health and our daily lives, digestive health, ironically, just doesn't come up often at the dinner table or much elsewhere. Our reluctance to talk about it can lead to negative health consequences. That's why today on Let's Talk New Mexico, we are breaking through the taboo and discussing all things gut health. And we want to hear from you. What have you always wanted to know about digestive health, but were too afraid to ask? What do you think parents, schools, and doctors should be teaching about gut health that they aren't? Have you struggled with a digestive condition that was difficult to discuss? Join the conversation and give us your take. Call in at 505-277-5866 or send an email to letstalk@kunm.org. Today we have three guests joining us. First up, live here in studio, we have Dr. Sephra Ryman. She is a clinical psychologist and the Associate Director of the New Mexico Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at the University of New Mexico, a job she just started this week, actually. She was formerly also working with the Mind Research Network. Good morning, and thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Next, over Zoom, we have Dr. Emran Meyer. He's a gastroenterologist, internationally recognized pioneer in research on the gut-brain axis and the microbiome, a distinguished research professor at UCLA and the founding director of the Goodman-Luskin Microbiome Center. He's also an author of several books, with a new one coming soon. Thank you so much for being here, Emran.
Thanks for inviting me, Daniel. It's a pleasure.
And finally, also joining us via Zoom, we have Dr. Tricia Pasricha. She's a gastroenterologist at Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital in Boston and an instructor at Harvard Medical School. She's also a medical journalist with the Washington Post, and she's the author of a book that just came out. We're going to be digging into that in just a bit. Good morning, and thank you so much for taking part in the conversation today.
So glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I'd like to start with you, Tricia, if we could. First things first, let's get some clarity on a few basics, if we could. What does the term gut health actually mean, and is it even a medically helpful term?
I would say about 15 years ago, no gastroenterologist was using that term, gut health. Gut health is something that I think really took hold on social media. And of course, hashtag gut health is its own conversation. And I think we're realizing that in some ways, academic medicine and academic gastroenterology, we've thought about gut health as really being defined as you have a disease, you don't have a disease. And I think what gut health means or should mean is something that is an evolving conversation, and we're trying to define it. But I do think it's a little bit less necessarily about, do you have a disease? I think people who have a known disease can have gut health. And it's really, I think, more about how your quality of life is impacted by your gut. And we want to minimize the amount of times that your daily life is disrupted because of your bowel symptoms. And I think if that's achieved, I think you can have gut health. But of course, there's a lot of misinformation that is going on social media that we have to work to counteract every day. But in its core, the concept of gut health is very sound and something that I think all of us want to achieve.
Mm-hmm. And again, while we're at it for basics, where exactly is the gut? What's included in that?
Yeah. And, you'd be surprised. It's not even a basic question. I think a lot of people struggle, right? And I think, like a lot of gastroenterologists probably would say, okay, the gut, we're really talking about the bowels, which is like maybe the colon, maybe the small bowel included in there as well. But I think the broader way of thinking about it is it's the gastrointestinal tract. And that could include everything from the mouth all the way down to the exit hatch. So, we in GI really do treat that entire area, that span. And so everything from the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, then the small bowel, then the large bowel, all of this falls under our realm.
So a larger systems view of things, yeah. And, a man who's very into systems, and we'll be digging into that later. Emrin, I've got a question for you. But fun fact, dear listener, if you count by cells, we are more microbe than we are human. Your colon alone holds about 38 trillion microbial cells, outnumbering the human cells of the entire body, which has about 30 trillion cells. Emrin, you've been studying and working with gut issues for more than 4 decades. 40 years ago, the idea that microbes in the gut could be influencing the brain was laughable, but we know better now. The microbiome is something that we hear about relatively often these days. Can you explain what it is and how it influences our bodies and our health?
Yeah, I have to admit that it's taken me quite a while to accept that concept based on the early studies in laboratory mice and rats, that there is this connection, this communication between the microbes in the gut and the brain, you could say, between one of the most basic ancient systems, the microbes, to the most sophisticated supercomputer that exists on the planet Earth. Seems like, far-fetched. And but I think today, particularly in the last 10 years, I think it's become pretty clear that there's multiple communication channels, both how the brain talks to the microbes and how the microbes can talk back to the brain by activating nerves in the gut that signal to the brain by stimulating the release of hormones like GLP-1 that then acts, on satiety centers within the brain. And also inflammatory signals, so the microbes are so close to our gut-based immune system that anything that goes wrong there leads to an engagement of the immune system in the gut, and that also signals to the brain. So we have a very complex bidirectional system. And I've mentioned this to you, I always emphasize this. It's not an axis, this is like saying there's an axis in your computer, it's a very complex system that generates an output. And we have come to a way to explain this. There's a new field of systems biology in medicine and science that fits perfectly what goes on between those two systems. So a long way from in the last 10 years, really a revolutionary change in the way we look at this.
Yeah. Yeah, and, Sephra, you study the exact thing that Emrin was just talking about. Unlike our other 2 guests this morning, whose primary focus is the gut, as a clinical psychologist, you're focused on the brain in clinical practice, but you're also a researcher who focuses heavily on the gut issue and the gut-brain connection. Can you expand a little bit more on what the gut-brain axis, as Emrin was saying, what that system is, how it works, and a bit about your research?
Of course. Yeah. And so I'm actually a clinical neuropsychologist. So clinical psychologist with specialized training in neuropsychology. So a lot of my clinical focus is trying to understand how we sort of maintain our cognitive functions. And when someone does have concerns about their cognitive functions, what's causing it? And so I think a lot of the progression of my career has been really interested in the brain and how it maintains cognitive abilities and what goes wrong in different conditions. So right now our lab is focused on Parkinson's and dementia with Lewy bodies, and I'm also a part of our Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And so you're asking a very big question, but I'll start to answer it. I'm sure we'll dive in deeper as we get through this. But so in terms of the brain as being, I think in neuroscience, there's been this progression of really conceptualizing the brain as a complex system and a complex dynamic system. And so from that, we're now extending that to the gut, where there's these bidirectional dynamic interactions and multiple complex pathways by which the brain can communicate with the gut. And so I don't know how far should we dive into how the brain controls the gut?
That is a question I have for later. I mean, we can dig into it a bit for now, just get the basics out of the way, yeah.
Well, yeah, I think I would love for our other speakers here to chime in on this. But we know, I think the idea from a neuroscience perspective, we've always, thought of the brain as the control system. It controls all bodily systems, which is sort of, putting the gut as this second tier system that receives input from the brain. But more and more we're appreciating that the gut is actually controlling its own functions and dynamically interacting. And so the bidirectional communication is increasingly appreciated.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that a little bit more, but we do have a caller who actually just called in, and I'd like to get to them if we could. We have Randa on the line from Santa Fe. Good morning, Randa. Can you hear me?
Yes, good morning. Thank you so much for taking my call. I never had any allergies, any digestive problems until I had a huge chemical exposure on my job. It happened to be carpet glue in 1989, and thereafter my system totally crashed. And I fortunately was sent to an immunologist that was familiar with what is now called multiple chemical sensitivity. And he said, here, stay on this diet, and we'll see if you improve. And this is real common with people that have had bad chemical exposure. Oftentimes it's pesticide. And many times, if their body does not detox, they continue to go downhill. And actually, many do actually starve to death because their body, it's sort of like chemical AIDS. Their body cannot digest food. But what has helped people the most is the far infrared sauna. A friend of mine who is an MD and practices medicine in this field, she was extremely ill and only could eat 3 foods for many years. And finally, she started doing the far infrared sauna, just like 5 minutes a day, a few times a week. And it's lightening the chemical load in the body. And since that, and her nervous system, my nervous system, starts to heal. And she was able to start eating more foods and get stronger and healthier. But you got to get rid of the chemicals, lighten the load in the body. But because this is related to chemical exposure, there's a lot of fight from the chemical industry for this to be recognized. So thank you for taking my call.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think that brings up something that's very interesting that I would like to talk about. When people do have complicated diets, obviously that can restrict nutritional intake and cause all sorts of problems. If somebody has, allergies like that, how can that affect their life and their nutritional intake? What do you do with somebody who has a difficult diet like that? Tricia, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, I appreciate what the caller has been going through. It sounds like it's been a really difficult couple of years. I can speak a little bit more broadly about sometimes things that happen to the gut that can cause changes. It's very common actually that people get an infection as one trigger. For example, a norovirus or something like this, and it's a one-time exposure. It's something that just happens in a day. They get food poisoning, and then for weeks, for months, for years, they feel that their gut is not the same ever again. And I think probably in a lot of cases, infection has been the best studied. But there are certainly different changes that we know have been occurring in relation to pesticide exposure, for example. Like everyone here on this call is familiar with the data on paraquat and Parkinson's disease and what are the chemicals in ultra-processed foods. That's very closely linked to irritable bowel syndrome symptoms. So I think there's a lot that we still don't quite understand. But what we do know is that certain types of exposures, and I'll come back to infection because that is probably some of the best studied, that can cause food intolerances afterwards. It can cause increases in how much pain somebody experiences day to day in their gut, because the sensitivity of those nerves, they will change. Even though that exposure happened even just once, one time they became infected or they got exposed to some chemical just once, now the threshold at which those nerves fire is so much lower. And that can take a long time to change again. And that can look and feel like food intolerances. And of course, that's only one pathway. Sometimes food intolerances, which are, in our world, a little bit different than true food allergies, the kinds of things you might get like a skin prick test and you say, oh yeah, clearly you're having this systemic allergy to, a kiwi or something like this. In these cases, oftentimes those skin prick testing are normal, but people still feel really different when they eat certain foods, feel bad, they don't tolerate them. Well, what is that? Well, in those cases, it can be a number of things. One, it could be related to the nerves. It could be another connected issue. That is how the immune system is becoming activated, and maybe even mast cells just inside the gastrointestinal tract becoming activated. And there are a lot of different pathways, and I think no person is going to be exactly the same, but these have been well studied. And it does bring up a problem that we see often just clinically, which is that oftentimes people say, I feel like I can't eat anything, and I've tried to cut down all these different foods. So they'll go online and they'll say, okay, well, let me try cutting gluten down. Well, let me try cutting lactose down. Let me try cutting FODMAPs down, which is this group of foods that are fermentable and can sometimes cause trouble. And then by the time sometimes they reach our clinic, they're eating just very, very narrow kinds of diets. Like they'll maybe just bread, maybe just rice, things like this, and soups. And it's hard to live like that. So usually when I see somebody who's in this situation, one, we do try to understand what is that root cause? What is the underlying issue? Is it related to the nerves? Is it related to some form of immune activation or something else entirely that we can treat? And then two, is it truly necessary that we cut out all of the different foods that you have? And often I work with a registered dietitian to kind of see how broadly we can reopen the doors again to get people to eat the most foods that they can tolerate. And sometimes I find that a lot of times people will read things and they'll say, okay, I've heard I shouldn't eat these foods. So they cut it out. But actually, it doesn't have an effect on how they feel. They've just been told that's the right thing to do and that'll help them. And so some of what I do is a lot of reteaching and trying to get to the bottom of how this all started.
Mm-hmm. I saw a lot of nodding heads while you were talking there, and I know that people we're going to react to that, and I want to talk about infections as well with something once we get back from the break. We got to do that real quick. This is Let's Talk New Mexico on 89.9 KUNM. We're taking your questions and comments about gut health. What have you always wanted to know about how things work down there? Give us a call, 505-277-5866, or email letstalk@kunm.org. I'm Daniel Montano. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Let's Talk New Mexico. I'm Daniel Montano. We are taking your calls about all things digestive health. Do you have a digestive condition? What assumptions do people make about your situation? Join in the conversation by calling 505-277-5866 or emailing letstalk@kunm.org. So part of what inspired me to do the show today was actually the experience of a very dear friend of mine. Because of social and industry pressures as a model, she abused laxatives to keep off weight, which caused an initial weakening of her intestines. Cut to about 15 years later, which was probably about 2020, 2021, she was in a social situation where, out of potential embarrassment, she didn't let herself pass gas or have a bowel movement for more than a week. Her stool got dry and hard and caused a tear in her intestine. She had to go in for an emergency surgery, ended up with an ileostomy bag for about 3 years. For listeners who don't know, an ileostomy bag is a medical device that reroutes the contents of your intestines into a bag that's worn on the abdomen rather than the natural way out, which they did in her case to help clear up an infection that developed in that colon tear. And it all started out of ignorance. She simply wasn't aware that any problems could come up. Tricia, your new book is titled You're Pooping All Wrong, and it deals with a lot of misinformation and misunderstandings about our digestive health. Can you expand on that lack of education around one of our most basic bodily functions?
Yeah, and first I'll just say I'm so sorry that this happened to your friend. And parts of that story are very familiar, at least. I think a lot of people feel embarrassment about their bowels. And actually this social fear of like passing gas in front of other people like really does lead to a lot of problems in people. But to take a step back, one of the reasons I wrote this book, You've Been Pooping All Wrong, and I gave it that somewhat memorable title that I did, is simply because when I started seeing people in my clinic, I realized how hard it is for people to even say the name of the thing that is bothering them, right? And I even learned that, when you go to a probably standard doctor's office, your primary care doctor, they're going to ask you about your bowel movements. And I remember when I was a medical student, I was shadowing a lot of doctors who would say this, and everyone is uncomfortable talking about this topic, like even in the doctor's office. And finally, I met one gastroenterologist I shadowed, and he just turned to this young guy. He was in college, and he was like, "So, tell me about your poop." And you could just see the whole room change. Like suddenly, that guy relaxed. They both laughed a little bit. And this patient just told him everything that had been going on. And after that, it was like this light bulb moment for me where I was like, okay, I'm going to do this too. I want to make this a comfortable conversation. And truly, I mean, we are gastroenterologists. This is like what we talk about all the time. Why should we overly medicalize the language and make everybody awkward about it? And I think a lot of people stop talking about poop after they get potty trained. Their parents tell them this is embarrassing. Don't you dare make fart sounds at the dinner table. And, all of that is like fine to some extent, I suppose. But I really think then people later develop a sense of shame about their bodies, and that's not fine. And so what I hope to do is, one, destigmatize the conversation because the problems are real. They're not necessarily just a question of social stigma. They go so beyond that too. They become a problem with early onset colorectal cancer, with irritable bowel syndrome, which affects about 15% of the US population. That is a huge number of people living with this, and even more who don't have a diagnosis, but who are experiencing at least part of what your friend experienced, which is just this stigma and shame around just having to do something that is so incredibly natural with our bodies.
Mm-hmm. Emran, I'm curious what your reaction is to what Tricia said in your own practice as a gastroenterologist. What have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, I found that over the years, I've sort of refined this. If you present the interactions between the brain, the mind, emotions, and the gut in a easily understandable way, not in a psychological way, but in a physiological way, 99% of patients totally accept that model because that's what they experience. This patient, your friend, a good example. I mean, the shame is not perceived by the gut, but it's perceived by the brain, and then the brain sends down signals to the gut, which can inhibit peristalsis, secretion, resulting in constipation. So this interaction, I think it's been the messaging of the medical system that has really contributed to this situation. If you, and I mean, just to repeat this, if you explain to somebody or give them examples of how anxiety, anger, how they have changed their bowel function and what they feel is going on inside, they say, yeah, that's exactly what I've been experiencing. And then if you explain that this is based on this bidirectional biological communication between the brain and the gut, everybody accepts that. If you say it in the wrong term, said, your symptoms are in your head, it's all in your head, then it has the opposite effect. And then it triggers these feelings of shame and frustration. And so I think a lot of it is the messaging of the medical system, particularly gastroenterologists, when a patient presents with these problems. And I'm not even sure if gastroenterologists are the best audience. I mean, gastroenterologists are not really trained in this kind of language around what you can say, what you can't say. Gastroenterologists talk about, do you need a colonoscopy or, need to test your stool for blood, but they're not trying to talk about what kind of poop you have. And so, a lot of patients seek elsewhere for advice, and they get it now extensively with this interest in gut health from the social media realm, and from functional medicine practitioners. But I don't think it's really made it into the common language of gastroenterologists. This may still happen, but I'm sure people that are listening, I see it on my own patients when they come. They've usually seen between 2 and 5 specialists, gastroenterologists, before without getting an answer. So to summarize this, I think it's the communication that our specialty has to learn to accept the patient's symptoms as real, have a biological answer to it that meets the patient's model. You don't want to explain to them something that they don't believe in. And it becomes quite easy and much more satisfying for the patient, I would say.
Mm-hmm. We actually got an email that touches on a couple of things that you brought up there. This is an email from Elaine. She writes, I have started a new medication for lowering cholesterol. I can't take statins. This is Zetia, or however that's pronounced. But as soon as I started it, I started to experience depression, brain fog, fatigue, constipation, and loss of appetite. Those side effects are bothering my mental and gut health, which are related. I'm trying to weigh the benefits and feeling like this, blah. So, I'm curious, first off, to the doctors in the room, if you have a response to Elaine. And then, obviously, this is an interesting concept of having a side effect cause a problem that then is bigger than the original problem itself, right? What would you suggest for somebody in Elaine's position? Either Trish or Emran.
Just a quick comment. There's obviously alternatives to statins. So if somebody has these side effects to statins in general, you would go, to another medication. That's not the only thing that you can do. That would be step one. I mean, once, as Elaine experienced, once these symptoms arise, I think the main thing is to say this is. Once you get off this medication, your symptoms will probably go away, normalize, and you have to, should focus on things you can do to feel better about your gut, and are not bothered by these symptoms that probably start in the gut and then reach the brain, and then the brain responds and sends signals back to the brain. So when you have these side effects, it triggers a vicious cycle, information that this is not a right thing for you goes to the brain. Warning lights go off within, certain systems in the brain. The brain sends down response signals to the gut, and that sets up a vicious cycle, causing chronic symptoms. So I think step one, look for an alternative, and step B, emphasizing this is not something that needs to stay with you for the rest of your life. I mean, you can definitely get back to your normal digestive function.
I'd like to move real quick to Sephra. Emran mentioned a couple answers ago about how the internet is full of claims that the gut controls everything from anxiety to Alzheimer's. Where do you think the science is strongest today, and where do you think people are getting ahead of the evidence?
That's a great question. I think, there's a lot of excitement about the gut and all the potential interventions and ways we can modify the gut. It's a lot easier to modify the gut than it is the brain. So this certainly, from a scientific perspective, opens so many opportunities. And, I think we're just still in the early days of really understanding mechanistically, though, what exactly is happening, where are the opportunities for interventions. And I like some of this prior discussion about gastroenterology being this field that's, historically, the gastroenterologists, they're concerned about identifying, cancer, major inflammatory bowel diseases. And so there's this big gap right now where we're just starting to understand sort of those in between, like the, people who just suffer from irregularity or difficulty with constipation. Those things, we don't really address them very well right now. And I think it'll be really exciting as I think gastroenterology as a field starts to really, I hope move into this space. I imagine it'll be in collaboration with primary care and really understanding. And, that's where the social media is right now. I think there's a lot of suggested treatments and interventions and things that we hopefully can study scientifically and really fine-tune what are the right answers for those individuals. And particularly irritable bowel syndrome, I think, is one of the obvious areas that is we need to improve our options there. And from the brain perspective, I mean, I think it's really I like to think of when I see a lot of patients who have either neurodegenerative diseases or a combination of psychiatric diseases, and oftentimes these groups of patients, we don't talk about gut health. And so even just integrating that into how we approach these patients and understanding, what are their habits, how can we better address the gut component as well as the psychological and the neurological components. There's just a lot that we can do, but we don't have a lot of clear answers about what to do at this point. And in terms of neuropsychology, I think it's really variable in to what extent neuropsychologists even ask about gut health and conceptualize that as potentially playing a role in patients' presentation. So, a lot of excitement, a lot of, I think, opportunity to better care for and help people, but the science is kind of in its early stages because it takes a lot. It's a lot of effort to conduct controlled clinical trials, and in the context of some of these disorders, there might be some other higher priority things on the docket, but we've definitely seen a revolution where there's a lot more scientific funding going into this area, and it's really exciting. So
it's starting to roll up, it sounds like, but maybe if people are hearing claims that sound miraculous online, they should temper and wait until the science develops. It sounds like kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from the other guests, I think, about what do you recommend in someone, how can patients or people who are concerned about their gut health, what should they be doing? How do they evaluate what's said online, and how do they navigate the provider to reach out to?
We will answer that from Emrin and Tricia once we get back from the last break we have to take here. We are talking about gut health and all the amazing things that happen in our abdomens, and we're still taking your questions and comments. Give us a call at 505-277-5866 and throw in your 2 cents. This is Let's Talk New Mexico on 89.9 KUNM. I am Daniel Montano. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Let's Talk New Mexico on KUNM. We are breaking the taboo today and talking about all things gut health, and there's still time to be part of the conversation. Call in at 505-277-5866 or shoot us an email at letstalk@kunm.org. And right before the break, Sephra, I think, posed a great question to Emrin and Tricia, our guests today, about, as people are online trying to navigate and find information about what's happening with their gut health, what do you recommend to your patients as far as like parsing through that information?
Yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things. I mean, one, you've mentioned, I think, the number one guiding principle that I have, which is that if it sounds too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true. And it's hard because, we did this study in our field that came out within the last year of who's putting out the information on gut health on TikTok and social media. And they looked at all the people producing content. And it turns out the vast majority of those people were not gastroenterologists. And for the most part, they actually weren't even people who had some form of an adjacent degree. It was really more influencers, sometimes patients themselves who had experienced things in their journey and wanted to share about that. And a lot of the information, whether it was explicitly stated or not explicitly stated, which I think the most concerning category, came from people who had some vested interest financially in a product that was being discussed. And so I think a question I ask myself when I'm looking at information online is, one, What is the motive of this person potentially? Are they sharing something that really help them truly and they want to help others, or are they selling a product? And that's really important to understand. Two, is what this person's saying so different from what the National Institutes of Health website is saying, from name your favorite hospital's website is saying, Mayo Clinic, Mass General, and any big hospital you want. Oftentimes these hospitals put out health information that's been vetted. If what somebody is saying feels really different from what these institutions that you might otherwise trust, you kind of have to take that to a step back and say why. And I feel very wary whenever I see content that starts with, here's what your doctor's not telling you. You know, this sense of like, you have been misled by academia, by scientists. I'm the voice that you can trust, and I'm going to tell you something that's not been sold. That's a dangerous premise. Often what they're about to tell you hasn't been said by your doctor because it's not validated by the science. And so I think anyone who's trying to let you in on a secret that makes you feel that there is an enemy, again, we're moving away from science, which has no enemies, and there is no sort of right or wrong. There's just the data is what it is. And I think framing something that way, hearing that framing should be a red flag to you. And I think when in doubt, the absolute most important thing you can do is collect all the information you're hearing and seeing online, come up with a list of questions, write them down, and bring them to your actual doctor in person. I know that's sometimes easier said than done because who can get an appointment with their doctor the next day? That's hard. But talking to somebody who knows your history, knows the data, and you coming in prepared with your exact questions can really be the thing that will make a difference to you as an individual, rather than some 60-second TikTok that's prepared for the, hundred thousands of people who are going to just watch it at midnight under their covers in bed.
Just a comment on that. It's unfortunate that, today people put more weight on the number of followers than on, the credentials and the training and the publication. That's becoming more and more apparent, that people don't even look at something that, may be scientifically based, because it can't be true, because if, this person doesn't have 200,000 followers or 1 million followers. So that's one thing. The second one I find is the actual, so to your question, what can they do for their gut health? There's actually quite a simple recommendation that I give my patients. If you take care and do the things that are best for your gut microbiome, you probably do the best for your gut health as well, because these two systems have evolved over millions of years. There's been a lot of symbiosis, a lot of exchange of information, a lot of storage of wisdom and, the right response patterns in these millions of genes the microbes have. They have a lot more than we do. So if you trust in this principle, if you do what's good for the microbes, which is basically, from a dietary standpoint, it's, I would say Mediterranean type diet. It doesn't have to be Mediterranean, but could be Asian, could be, it doesn't matter which origin it has. Very high in complex carbohydrates, i.e. fiber, high in polyphenols. This is what the microbes thrive on, because we can't absorb these molecules. The microbes break them down into smaller molecules to feed themselves and to send them back into our body. And if you start with that diet, with that dietary recommendation, and there's some things that give you more gas than you're comfortable with, then you can modify that part of it. You don't have to go to a new diet. You don't have to go to a keto diet, or you don't have to go. It's modification of the basic healthy diet that we know. And just coming back to the Mediterranean diet, I always love this idea. This has been around for at least 2,000 years and it's been in this huge laboratory of countries and peoples living around the Mediterranean basin, from Africa to Southern Europe. And they have experimented with, particularly in Rome, that had all the immigrants with their cuisine, their preferred tastes. And ultimately, they've come up with something that satisfies a lot of people. And so it's not only healthy, but it's tasty. So it was like that laboratory idea that the Mediterranean basin was a laboratory to come up with a sort of a major strategy to improve your gut microbial health and automatically your gut health.
Mm-hmm. Well, along those same lines of the questions we were just answering, we've got a few callers actually that came in that hopefully we can get to in the next 10 minutes or so. First up, we have a name that I think you've been on the show with us actually, Representative Tara Lujan, who's in Santa Fe, is on the line. Good morning, Representative. Thank you for calling in.
Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to call in. I'm listening to the discussion, and I find that it's so relevant right now with a lot of things that are going on through the scope of as a policymaker. And I'm just wondering, has anyone really looked into any kind of regulating policy regarding social media and information and misinformation that is given out by individuals, as you're talking about, that don't even have a medical background, scientific background, or any kind of background that would give them a priority to say that, this is medically sound? And if you have, what does that look like from your perspective?
Trish and Emran, did you guys hear that question fully?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, thank you for that question. It's a question we think about all the time. I'll preface this by saying I'm very active myself on social media, for better or for worse. There was, 5 years ago, there was this idea that social media was this big quagmire and ripe with misinformation. And a lot of academic doctors like myself were like, why would we step into this space? And I was one of them. And I stepped into it entirely because it's a quagmire. And if we don't try to get some voices in there talking and providing what we think is evidence-based medicine, then the void will be filled with people who aren't. And so there's a couple of things that are steps in the right direction that's being taken in terms of how to regulate some of this information. And I think both are probably not adequate yet. But one is technically, we are supposed to all, if you accept or profit off of a product, you are supposed to disclose that. You're supposed to have #ad or #gifted, or it's supposed to be prominently displayed somewhere else. The problem is that in reality, this is not often disclosed, nor is the disclosure of these things enforced. That's problematic. But there are some rules and guidelines in there for influencers. And this is a big problem in the gut health space because the probiotics alone, that's $1 billion industry, and those are often being sold online. And if we take a step back, the American Gastroenterological Association actually does not recommend probiotics for most indications, right? They don't say everyone should be on one for gut health. They don't say even people with IBS should be on one. There are a few narrow exceptions to that, but the way it's marketed on social media, you really feel like everyone's supposed to be on a probiotic. That's just not what the data shows. And I would say most of the time when I see these kinds of reels and TikToks, I'm not seeing the disclosure that I'd like to see. So that's one thing. And then more recently, a lot of us have probably seen online that there's now some companies, some of these social media companies have this box where you can, where other viewers can add commentary, add context to the reel and what's being spoken. I think we've seen sometimes very quickly that the commentary added and the clarifications that the audience, the community adds has been helpful to spot misinformation and correct it. I've personally, I think a lot of people have also seen a lot of situations where the community context kind of backfires. Like they would get it wrong and it's not quite right. And then who is supposed to produce that? How does that change it? The reason I think these are a step, potentially in the right direction, but not the main thing, is that I think what needs to really happen is the algorithm needs to prioritize accurate health information. And that is the thing, rather than the most viral statement, the hottest take being the thing that gets served, who can grab your attention in the first 3 seconds. That's what's currently the way the algorithm works. That's what you're getting. It's not really based on the validity or even the potential harm that this content would do. That's playing out in lots of different spheres. That's a bigger conversation that we are having, of course, in GI, but I'm all over the country. People are having this. And I think that's the only way to really make an impactful change.
I mean, to weigh into this, you mentioned a good example, probiotics. Probably 90% of probiotics don't really do much besides a placebo effect. And some people, they do work. But despite that, and despite what Tricia said, that the major professional organizations are not endorsing them for many of the indications that are given, the sales are booming, multi-billion-dollar industry and still growing. The same thing happened, for example, with this peptide frenzy. All of a sudden, people are recommending to use molecules that have not been tested for their safety or for their effectiveness, and all of a sudden, millions of people are taking this because they think it's the miracle to longevity, to healthy longevity. And these are two extreme examples. You can apply this to many others. I'm actually skeptical that anything can be done given the way the social media enterprise works and how lucrative it is for people. I'm just very doubtful that a company would stand up and say, we're going to stop this, because the millions of users would drop, would not continue. So it's going to be interesting how this will evolve, this, misinformation campaign that we're exposed to, particularly in the space of gut health. I mean, there's other areas as well, and politics, but I mean, in terms of gut health, and it's great for this process to have something as poorly defined scientifically as gut health, because obviously it was easier to define gut diseases. That's what we were trained in as gastroenterologists. But once you get to this concept of gut health, you can bend it any way you want. And that's what's happening in the social media space and the recommendations that are, being made.
Mm-hmm. So we don't have too much time left, but I really would like to get to a couple of, hopefully, two more callers if we can. First up, we have Bryn from Albuquerque. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, Bryn.
Hey, hi.
Yes.
It's Sabrine, and thank you. And thank you all for talking about something that no one likes talking about, but we all should. I have a very dear friend who does not have a gallbladder, and she has developed explosive acid diarrhea. And I know from my own experiences that things like pelvic floor physical therapy exercises, modified bridges, work with incontinence for the bladder, and I understand it also works for the bowel. So I would love it if you could talk some about exercises people can do to strengthen the area around the colon and around the gut, as well as how to strengthen peristalsis for people.
I would say, maybe Tricia has a better answer to this. So there's definitely techniques, for strengthening pelvic floor muscles and combating, rectal incontinence. Some very effective techniques, unless there's major mechanical damage to the sphincter muscles. I think once it gets to influencing colon motility or transit with such kind of techniques, I think the evidence is much weaker, and it gets into this, poorly defined area. So, for example, if you take patients with IBS, the subgroups with constipation, with diarrhea, mixed bowel habits, the subgroup with constipation, the majority of these, we've done these assessments on 100, maybe thousands of patients, have completely normal colonic transit. So if you went to a therapist and said, I want to improve my colonic transit because I have IBS with constipation, what are they treating? They're not really. What they think they're treating is not the problem. Mm-hmm. And so I would say, answering the caller's question, we have some very effective techniques for improving continence, fecal continence. But if it goes beyond that, like biofeedback influence on on intestinal motility and transit, the field is very poorly defined, and I don't think we have really effective therapies right now to do that.
So possibly looking up fecal continence exercises would work, maybe. Tricia, did you have any other suggestions?
Yeah, a couple quick things is that, one, I think oftentimes when I recommend pelvic floor physical therapy to especially women, they're like, well, I had this already. I remember after I gave birth, I had that. And I want to just make sure that we're distinguishing that the kinds of pelvic floor physical therapy for fecal incontinence, or what we might call accidental bowel leakage, it's actually pretty different than for urinary incontinence. It's a different type of technique. The studies have really shown what Dr. Meyer had said. Biofeedback is the technique you want to ask about. And you want to be clear that we're talking about fecal incontinence to get the right type of therapy. You'll learn these techniques and you can do them at home, but it's really like less of something I want you to Google, and I really want you to meet a physical therapist trained in this in person. So that's one thing. And then second, I think exactly as Dr. Meyer said, there's not really like physical therapy techniques that will increase motility. There are certain things naturally that increase motility and can stimulate rectal contractions. For example, exercise of some form can move things along. Drinking coffee is a nice augment. 1 out of 3 people know this is true. Will start rectal contractions and people have to go. So there are some things you can kind of do naturally in your lifestyle. It sounds to me like your friend may have the opposite problem though. And so I would certainly encourage her to meet with a gastroenterologist. Often when we get our gallbladders removed, gallbladders hold these bile salts that we produce, and those can be very irritating to the lining if they just kind of get dumped out quickly because now we don't have our gallbladder. There are certain medications that can help with that if that's what's driving these problems. So it's worth, if she hasn't already, talked to a gastroenterologist who kind of specializes in this.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've got not much time left, but Buick, if you're still on the line, would you like to maybe give a last comment before we sign off on the show?
Good morning. What an informative program. I appreciate it very much. I'm a psychotherapist. I was involved in research in the late 70s with an internal medicine doc on adjustment and learning. And the first thing that reacted to stress was the gut. GI issues were the first one. And there was just direct correlation between emotions and GI system. I appreciate that. I tell you, nothing like understanding the process of our miraculous body. Thank you for this good, informative program.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Buick, for calling in. And thank everybody out there so much for tuning in and listening to the show today. It has been an absolute blast. Sephora, before we go, did you have one last comment?
Oh, I appreciate that caller. I think, we could probably talk for a whole other hour about the importance of, or the bidirectional nature of psychological health and gut health. So don't neglect the psychological health. It's intricately linked with gut health. So thank you so much for having me.
Definitely. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to everyone who called or emailed to share your thoughts, and thanks so much to all of our guests. We had Dr. Tricia Pasricha, Dr. Emran Meyer, and Dr. Sephora Ryman. It has been a pleasure to have all of you. And you, dear listener, can find more information about our guests as well as other links on the web post for today's show at kunm.org. We'll also have audio from today posted up there soon. You can also hear the show and subscribe to it on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Now, let's keep the conversation going. Share your ideas and thoughts to our pages on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, or in the comments on YouTube, where we post a full video of today's show. Just search for KUNM Radio. And you can always reach the show by emailing letstalk@kunm.org. Let's Talk will be back next week with Megan Kamrick, who will be discussing business incubators. Our engineers, Marino Spencer, news director Megan Kamrick, answered the phones. The mercurial Ty Bannerman produced the show, and I've been your host, Daniel Montano. Thanks for tuning in to Let's Talk New Mexico.